Welcome back to another Sister for Sister Story Time session with your favorite sister, Shia, lawyer, the fire starter. Um, we are reading chapter 6 of the book Against the Apocalypse. And it is by David G. Roskis. So the self under siege, and I, a person who for years had been removed from everything, thought to myself, a generation of iron men will arise and they will rebuild what we permitted to be ruined. Lamed Shapiro, 1909. If neither God nor his surrogates had any say in the course of Jewish history, as the modernist pogrom poem made amply clear, and if the community no longer provided refuge in times of war and revolution, as demonstrated in a variety of shtetl novellas, then the last and only holdout was the individual, emancipated from God and community. Yet in Eastern Europe, where the claims of tradition and community were so much stronger than in the West, the course of emancipation never did run smoothly, especially as the path led through landscapes of such vast destruction. Nor would the community give up its claim on the individual so easily. Ever since the first Jew tried to remove himself from the crowd of exiles mourning by the waters of Babylon, the presence of the one still implied the presence of the many. For if the self desired to bear witness to the destruction, it then became the symbolic survivor of the community, and thus the community in miniature, or if, as a result of ideology or devastation, it wished to detail its willing or unwilling departure from the community. The rejected group loomed just as large as the self, and if, despite all odds, the self succeeded in negating the group, the self was invariably lost as well. Paradoxically, the impact of catastrophe in the 20th century was not to emancipate the Jewish individual from his collective base, but to open him up to his other female half. Throughout the pre modern period, women had been given minimal attention in Jewish responses to catastrophe, except to occupy the most stereotypic roles. Jerusalem, a grieving woman in mourner's clothes, Mother Rachel weeping for her children, women dying as they nursed. In martyrological accounts from Second Maccabees until Hanover's The Deep Mire, heroic women had usually remained nameless. The most famous woman martyr, who had sacrificed her 7 sons and then herself, was known alternately as Miriam and Hannah. Men had been so much in control of the liturgy that even when they had written special tickings or prayers for women, such as the New El Malay Rahaman prayer, published in the Nawi Dwar in 1813, there had been but a passing reference to Hannah's martyrdom, whereas all 6 of the rabbis and communal leaders killed in the slaughter of 1656 had merited special mention. How the liturgy would have been different if women had written the prayers is difficult to tell. Perhaps there would have been a greater emphasis on the lost children or agonat, or perhaps women would have enjoyed a greater share in the world to come. Not until the last decades of the 19th century did the status of Jewish women in traditional society become a serious issue, thanks to the influence of Russian and Polish positivism. It was in the next generation, however, that writers began to explore the individualization of the self and attempted, for the first time outside of Kabbalistic literature, a psychological integration of male and female aspects. With the coming of revolution and world war, men were all being torn from their homes, and it was time at last to give up the image of the male rescuing the weeping female community of Jews in Eastern Europe. Consequently, writers were freer to work with images of destruction that might make more sense to or appeal equally to women. The fragmented text written in response to modern violence were actually attempts to bring together on equal footing male and female retrojections of catastrophe and trauma. In literature, if not in life, women could now bear witness both for themselves and for the men. In the classical Jewish memoir, such as it was, the author was expected to dwell on the collective or moral significance of the past, not on its personal dimensions. This was because the careful plotting of the soul in search of perfection, the core of the confessional genre since the days of St. Augustine, was foreign to Jewish tradition outside of the Kabbalah. Typically, the stimulus for the writing of a Jewish memoir was the precipitous end of an era, usually as a result of catastrophe. Jews set a sense of longing once the foundations of society as they knew it had been fundamentally altered, or they tried to restore a sense of equilibrium in the face of a new catastrophe by recalling the bitter experiences they had withstood in the one before. At each breaking point, the Spanish expulsion, the Khmelnytsky massacres, the incursion of modernity into Western and Eastern Europe, the pogroms, the revolutions, the rescue operation was launched anew. As Jacob Shatsky put it with a touch of irony, only that which was lost forever was of interest to Jews. The will to bear particular witness had to be cultivated. Nothing in my research suggests that it is an innate faculty of humankind, Jewish or otherwise. The impetus within the Jewish community came from a small group of intellectuals, such as historian Simon Dubnow, who called on former Cantonists to record their saga for publication in his Russian language journal, or from the Yiddish writers Peretz Denizen and Ansky, who, in a long winded manifesto issued on New Year's Day 1915, warned their readers: "Woe to the nation whose history is written by foreign hands and whose own writers are left to later compose only songs of lament, penitential prayers, and threnodies." At least one young woman, and Kahan, heeded their call by keeping a wartime diary. What did come naturally to Jews once engaged in the memorial enterprise was to include the culture as a whole, the town, the community. This parochial collective and liturgical slant on historical experience was radically challenged by the Great War and the Bolshevik Revolution. The Great War occupied a unique place in the annals of Jewish suffering because, in addition to reasons given in earlier chapters, it was the first catastrophe that Jews in vast numbers experienced as soldiers and as enemies to one another. Throughout the war zone, for instance, Ansky recorded numerous variants of a single story, always told as an actual occurrence. Two soldiers supposedly met in hand to hand combat, and one stabbed the other with his bayonet. Shema Yisrael, the dying soldier called out with his last breath, and the enemy realized in horror that he had killed another Jew. Ansky recognized this legend as the symbolic kernel of the tragedy, a nation caught up in a world torn apart. Jews suffered from two distinctly different forms of violence in the Great War: the familiar violence of pogroms, expulsions, and forced labor, and the impersonal, mechanized violence of the trenches. This duality is clearly reflected in the literature. For one thing, translations into Yiddish of the best-selling European war novels focused on the devastating effects of trench warfare. Andreas Latsko's Men in War 1918, one of the first important anti-war narratives, appeared in Yiddish a year after its original publication in German. Then followed Henry Barbuse's Under Fire in 1924, Jaroslav Has Sex, The Good The Good Soldier, Schweik in 1928, Eric Maria Remarks, All Quiet on the Western Front in 1929 and 1930, and Ludwig Ren's War in 1930 to 31. Significantly, Ernst Junger's The Storm of Steel, which accepted the war as a necessary higher reality, was never translated. All this challenged the Jewish writer to confront the universal dimension of violence, to apply the vocabulary of Jewish suffering beyond its particularist setting. The tension between the universal and the particular was perhaps most acute in a new genre produced by the war: the memoirs of Jewish medics, officers, ordinary soldiers, and prisoners of war. Punctuating the expose of army life with its cruelty and corruption were revelations of anti Semitism and of the uniquely tragic fate of the Jews. Out there in the trenches and field stations, there was no community to mediate the assault on one's body and soul. The Brotherhood of the Trenches, where all classes of French, German, British, and Italian doughboys discovered their common bond, be they poets, miners, peasants, or clerks, was less attainable in the multinational armies of the Tsar or of the Habsburg monarchy. The Russian or Polish Jewish soldier who hoped to achieve a degree of acceptance denied him in civilian life discovered more often than not that he shared a deeper bond with his Galician and German Jewish enemy than with his comrades in arms. Hatred from one's fellow soldiers was reinforced by a growing alienation from friends and family back home, who might not even be there at war's end. The armistice would not restore plundered Jewish property or reinstate exiled Jewish populations. To be a Jewish soldier, therefore, was to feel uniquely vulnerable, thrust with his comrades in arms into a mechanized warfare that was rapidly transforming the physical, political, and cultural landscape of Europe. The Jew was no better equipped to respond than anyone else. Certainly, the output of Jewish war poetry was meager and unexceptional, but be it that of Jacob Mestel and Noam Oislander writing in Yiddish, Avigdor Hamari and David Shimoni writing in Hebrew, or Aries V. Greenberg writing first in one language and then in the other. Once off the battlefield, however, the landscape of familiar destruction awakened the old patterns of response, like Gershon Levin and S. Ansky, who recognized the ancient signs of destruction as they stood before the ruins of Jewish Galicia. 26-year-old Isaac Babel recently joined up the Budionese 1st Cavalry Brigade, reaffirmed the truth of Lamentations even as he violated the commemorative fast. We devour the cooked potatoes like wolves, and each one has 5 glasses of coffee, the ninth of Av. The old Jewish woman howls, sitting on the floor. Her son, who idolizes his mother and says that he believes in God in order to do something pleasant for her, sings in a pleasant small tenor and tells the story of the destruction of the temple. The frightful words of the prophet. They eat manure. The girls are raped, the men slain, Israel destroyed, angry, wailing words. The lamp smokes, the old woman howls. Outside is the shtetl, Demi Dovka, Cossacks, everything like the time when the temple fell. Perhaps there were Jewish Cossacks once before in history, but none ever kept a diary or ever fashioned the memory of that impossible alliance into lasting works of art. Babel's Red Cavalry, as we shall see, represents one limit in the spectrum of Jewish behavior in extremis, whereas the moment of midrashic recall, facilitated by his knowledge of Hebrew, illustrates the recurrent norm. Despite the total and terrifying isolation felt by Jewish soldiers fighting in the Great War, the quintessential Jewish war memoir, the text that was later to inspire Ringelblum, Kaplan, Crook, and other ghetto diarists, remained Ansky's Kerbam Galitzi, precisely because the author submerged his personal experience so as to highlight the broad panorama of Jewish suffering. Only once in its 4 volumes did the author let down his guard with an outburst of joy at being alive. A diary was nothing if not subjective, and Shatsky, for one, faulted the author for his myopically critical view of Galician Jewry. But the collective was kept so consistently in focus that the reader forgot how central Ansky himself was to the events described. The diary told of a mission interrupted during the 4 month breach in the Russian front to aid his brethren in the occupied territories. At a time when Galicia was totally off limits, when those of its Jews not yet banished or murdered were banned from traveling or from engaging in commerce because all of them were viewed as traitors in the eyes of the Russian occupiers. Ansky raised the necessary capital and carried the relief effort single handedly from place to place. Since his was a self appointed mission, though subject to the vagaries of war, Ansky's memoir enjoys a narrative flow that is lacking in most diaries of soldiers sent to do battle first on one front and then on the other. Ansky, moreover, was retracing his steps, that is, revisiting some of the same towns where he had collected religious artifacts and had recorded folk songs, stories, sayings, and jokes during his celebrated ethnographic expedition prior to the war. Kerem Galitsi is therefore replete with anecdotes and ethnographic observations, a veritable encyclopedia of popular response to catastrophe. There is another equally impressive side to Ansky's memoir. If one may characterize his generation, as I did in chapter 4, as thoroughly at home in Jewish and general culture, as intellectuals who served universal causes with Jewish pride and who returned to serve their people in a spirit of universalism. Examples being Peretz, Shalom Aleichem, Dubnow, and Berdichevsky. Then Ansky surely stands out as the proudest of them all when he returned to Russia in 1905 and threw his energies into revolutionary politics and Jewish cultural causes. He could boast of a career as a Russian Narodnik, as private secretary to Peter Lavrov, as secretary of L'École Internationale in Paris, and as a cultural anthropologist. With his Russian liberal contacts, his flawless accent, and his uniform, Ansky had access to the whole military establishment, from the general staff to the raw recruits, and his portraits of Count Dolgorukov and Igor Demidov offer extraordinary insights into the misconduct of the war. At one point, Ansky even undertook a secret trip to St. Petersburg to alert the government as to the true conditions at the front. Here was the ultimate traveler disguised, whom the shtetl population greeted as a kind of Elijah figure, and who, dressed in officer's uniform, could lay bare the passion for bloodshed and the pathological hatred for Jews of his Russian compatriots. The ability to pass undetected from native to enemy turf would later become the essential ingredient of Jewish survival. Ansky's sense of mission carried over to the act of memory itself. A few months into the war, he, Peretz, and Denizen had issued their appeal against allowing strangers to write the history of the Jews during this tragic period. Soon, Ansky gave way to a deeper, more drastic fear, the fear that this history might not be written at all. The Russian press, including its liberal wing, believed the accusations of Jewish treason. Accounts of Jewish heroism was systematically censored, and a blackout was imposed on news of pogroms and expulsions. After July 1915, no Hebrew or Yiddish printed matter was allowed to pass through the Russian mails, and the Jewish press was forced to close. Thus, Ansky's task of rescuing lives and property was compounded by the need to make the story public, to use his access and authority to reveal what was happening to a whole tribe in Israel, the destruction of its eastern kingdom. One may generalize and say that in modern times the conspiracy of silence was directly proportional to the scope of Jewish catastrophe, whereas the Kishinev pogrom was documented, publicized, and protested throughout the Western world. The vastly greater destruction to Jews in World War I was noted by very few outside observers, and the Holocaust of Ukrainian Jewry in the Civil War that followed would have been all but erased from memory were it not for the efforts of a handful. In May of 1919, a terse appeal was issued by the editorial board to collect and research materials on the pogroms in the Ukraine. Jews, it read, a terrible pogrom disaster, Tehiha, has befallen our cities and towns, and the world does not know. We ourselves know nothing or very little about it. The deeds must not be suppressed in order to ensure the preservation of the data that started pouring in at the time when Petlura's forces, later Denikin's, later the Poles, and still later the Soviet regime tried to confiscate and destroy the archive. Multiple copies were made and deposited for safekeeping. In September 1921, the whole archive was smuggled out of the Soviet Union and brought to Berlin. Reporting on these 5 crates of Jewish rolls, Hirsch David Naumburg contrasted the Jews' task of documentation with that of the Gentiles. We Jews are fated to another kind of glorification. Like dogs, we lick away our own blood. We collect and collect and collect blood, tears, and sorrows. But even in the freedom of Berlin, only 2 volumes of the planned 7-volume history were published, and the third would not appear until 1965. In addition to this major monographic series, local histories were commissioned, creating a new genre, the documentary novel of destruction. Weaving a seamless narration out of eyewitness accounts, Rachel Feigenberg, a survivor herself, focused on the fate of a single shtetl in a chronicle of a dead town, the destruction of Dubov. Here, the anatomy of mass murder was laid out in agonizing detail, complete with reconstructed dialogues, and among its most horrifying accounts was the martyrdom of the rabbi, the father of Micah Joseph Berdichevsky. Despite all precautions, the archive was to share the survivor's fate, The major part was shipped to the YIVO, or the Yiddish Scientific Institute, in Vilna when Elias Scherikauer, its director and moving force, left Berlin for Paris in 1933. When the Nazis caught up with him in Paris, he fled to southern France, leaving behind his own manuscript on the pogroms and the remainder of the archive. At the end of 1940, it was rescued by Zoza Zachowski, historian, soldier, and resistance fighter, whose history of the archive forms the basis of this discussion. As for the bulk of the archive in Vilna, including the documentary film footage, the Nazis saw to its destruction in 1942. If Scherikauer's archive looked ahead to Ringelblum's Onig Shabbat in the Warsaw Ghetto, and Feigenberg anticipated the documentary novels on the Holocaust, then Eliezer David Rosenthal's epic list of destruction was the last successor to Hanover's The Deep Mire. 63-year-old Rosenthal, a maskell of the old school, survived a major pogrom in Teplitz and then proceeded to collect everything he could on the Ukrainian pogroms, to order the data alphabetically by town, to translate it into Hebrew and mail it letter by letter to Berlin, where Bialek, Ravnitsky, and Druyanov oversaw the publication. Only 3 volumes of the Scroll of Slaughter were published in his lifetime, reaching the letter Tet, and Yud was published a half century later. Rosenthal died in Odessa in 1932 in the most desolate conditions imaginable. And so the creation of an archive of destruction was a modern refraction of an earlier response. For the archive was an anonymous endeavor in the same way that Jewish lamentation was meant to be at once personal and anonymous. Yet, even with institutional backing, heroic feats of rescue, and the collaboration of trained historians, statisticians, journalists, and an army of anonymous collectors, everything conspired against the documentation of Jewish catastrophe. The fashioning of a personal identity is usually predicated on the possibility of choice and of making moral decisions. The soldier who volunteered to fight his way through the rubble was therefore in a much better position to impose his view and memory of things than the hapless, disoriented recruit. Ansky's memoir could be the most Jewish of them all because it was the most self determined. Modern Jewish writers who were in search of a contemporary hero worked under a double constraint. Eastern European society at large did not offer the Jew that many choices and human behavior was itself subject to inherent limitations. In literature, as in life, the real test of character came in extreme situations. Whereas writers of Peretz's generation had entered the 20th century unsure of what the future would bring and had therefore looked increasingly to the past to find instances of Jewish greatness, to Hasidism, water carriers, Cantonists, hidden saints and rabbis, daughters, writers of the next generation, born in the 1880s, developed their distinct character types to cover the scope of individual behavior under stress, the heroes of action, reaction, and inaction. To find models of bravery and physical prowess, these writers turned quite deliberately to the margins of Jewish society. Here they came upon the Baal Guf, an inarticulate boor who lived by his passions and responded not to the dictates of law, but to the varied cause of nature. He and his fellows were a motley group of thieves and roughnecks, but when Jews were in danger, they fought back, and when the draft board called them up, they went. Since the literary history of this intriguing character has yet to be written, and since he occupies a role in the Jewish fictional gallery no less prominent than that of Mendel or the Shtetl, I should mention something about his pedigree. Anyone, Jew or Gentile, could be Baal Goth or Baal Goof, provided he was relatively well endowed physically, economically, or both. The greater the deprivation in the society at large, the easier it was to qualify. Thus, a tavern keeper and a peasant farmer were suitable candidates if no one else around could eke out a living. Philosophically, the character can be traced to primitivist notions about the noble savage who gives vent to his original natural but subsequently repressed desires, or closer in time but different in teleology, to Nietzsche's Superman, unfettered by moral scruples. Be that as it may, his appearance marked a radical departure from anything ever called a Jewish hero before. Bialik, who launched the Baal Guf's literary career, played so skillfully on the character's inherent ambiguities that critics are still arguing about whether our Baal Guf 1899 is to be read as a positive or negative type. With Shalom Ash, born 1880, we come to the first Baal Guf story with an explicit ideology. The Kola Street irregulars are noble men of passion, bound to the rich Polish soil, just like the peasants and the horses of the region. The passivity and false pride of Scholars Street, where money and learning make their unholy alliance, is clearly no match for Cola Street, which was not in the diaspora, as it were. There, no Jew was ever beaten. If it happened that recruits passing through the town in the fall began to riot, members of the congregation would take matters into their own hands. Armed with shafts torn from carts and iron bars wrested from shutters, they would go out into the streets and teach the hooligans a lesson. Reb Israel, the oldest and most respected inhabitant of Cola Street, bridges the two with a deep sense of the past on the one hand and a code of frontier justice on the other. But not his son lives only in the present and only for his animals. Everything about Not suggests his deviant status. in Jewish folklore, not Ganeth, is the equivalent of Robin Hood, and Not's hobby, flying pigeons, is considered so despicable that since Mishnaic times, it disqualified people as witnesses. Mishnah Rosh Hashanah 1 and 8. The pigeons, in the end, mediate the violence that they provoke, a small scale pogrom in which the Gentile baker is killed and Not is badly wounded. The community exacts its guilt offering by killing off most of the birds, and the hero exercises his rage with the blood of the last surviving fledgling. Thanks to Ash, Cola Street became a generic name, the place in shtetl geography where the ne'er-do-wells hung out, where Jews and Gentiles worked in close proximity, where blood flowed freely and muscle was valued over mind. The street had been there before, but not until the transvaluation of values, when a new generation of Jews took history into their own hands, organizing strikes, self defense units, and revolutionary cells, did the cola streets of Eastern Europe present a model to be emulated. Before he could become a striker, fighter, or collective farmer, the new Jew was expected to shed the inhibitions of shtetl propriety, burgess respectability, and arid intellectualism. The Baal Goof represented this new Jew in his earlier rudimentary state, a man who acted alone on impulse but remained fiercely loyal to the tribe. Neither he nor his surrounding culture was yet responsive to history. What can be said about Benya Crick and Company, Babel's glowing contribution to this rogues gallery, holds true for the Baal Goof as a generic type. His actions sprang from his individual will, whereas the society around him was presumed to be static and outside history. To live unencumbered by the past or the future, that was the Baal Gulf's mandate. The whole community could quake in its boots each year in the spring when the recruiting officers came round and posted the list of draftees. And by early autumn, every self respecting Jewish youth dreaded the thought of the impending 3 year stint. But now writers' sympathies shifted to the side of those who made the best of it, who thought less and did more. The younger generation split into one half, the soft panty waist, who could be kneaded like clay figures. They went to synagogue to pray. And the other half, with Burl and Lot at their head, the roustabouts, they went to Laser's tavern. The crowd was made up of tough tailor lads, apprentices who couldn't read or write, and who had always regarded the military as bullshit. We'll get used to it soon enough. Sewing tunics, making boots, baking bread, who cares? And the 3 years will be up before you know it. We'll bring back a few hundred rubles. We'll see the world, and that'll help us make a decent match. 36 months, that's nothing. So live it up, boys. Live it up like there's no tomorrow. The point not to be missed about these foul mouthed, Yiddish speaking rowdies is their essential conservatism. Their highest aspiration is to return home with enough money to make a good match, with a Jewish girl, to be sure. And though Burl the Lout, the leader of the pack, feels free to prey upon the local moneybags, whose sons are often hiding, in a later episode of Official Bimco's Recruits, Burl's sense of honor sends him rushing to save some elderly Jews from peasant hands. The Baal Goof's behavior does not affect change. His behavior is society's barely sanctioned release mechanism and guarantee that everything in the end will return to what it was. The Schlemiel, who may be said to represent the normative type in Eastern European Jewish fiction, likewise makes no dent in the world, for he becomes a hero, as Ruth Wist put it so memorably, when real action is impossible and reaction remains the only way a man can define himself. Shalom Aleichem immortalized a whole town of Schlemiels, a town called Kazrelef, where the people use verbal aggression to fight off the forces of destruction. This leaves us with the characters who agonize so long and hard about their place in the world that their confrontation with society, when such occurs, leads nowhere. They are alienated urban intellectuals, perennial students who recently returned from some place in Switzerland, or self taught philosophers who mercilessly expose their own motives and those of others. They are called telushim, dangling men, and have no place to go, caught between the lost world of tradition and inaccessible worldly pleasures. They are now a new breed who live on the periphery of politics and culture, knowing too much and doing too little. They are close cousins of characters in Peretz, Bershadsky, Shekov, Maeterlinck, and Hamsun, whose story is typically told in monologue form, in short sketches of entries of a diary, that is, in a form that closes out any but their own solipsistic and passive view of life. What happens to such tortured souls in the face of catastrophe mirrors more directly than anything we have seen the collapse of normative behavior, the denial of meaningful choices, and the crippling burden of memory. Unlike the Baal goof, who is very much rooted in a physical environment, and unlike the Schlemiel, who holds fast to a belief in the basic goodness of God and his world, the Talush is not bound by any place, and having no transcendental faith to uphold, he is utterly defeated in the end. He may, like Zalman Schneer's students, return home immediately from Switzerland on receiving news of the pogrom, and when the actual death toll surpasses his most feverish imaginings, he may raise a great cry of revenge. But the Talusha's world is also fragmented, no more so than in periods of catastrophe, and the enemy is everywhere. Where was this monstrous pogrom beast, he may ask. I haven't seen her. I had seen only fragments of her. So all the pent up anger will be vented instead of the shoemaker's dog, his childhood enemy, will, and even this pathetic act of vengeance will leave him trembling, fearing that the Gentile neighbor overheard, or he may, like I.D. Berkowitz, young man with blue tinted glasses and a sheepskin coat and a finished collar, fancy himself the God-given leader of his suffering flock. In the dark and terrible night of 1905 through 1906, with a group of panic-stricken Jews behind him, he will seek revenge from the pogrom in a charity hospital and be totally unmanned by the Gentile janitor. The illiterate janitor lording it over the educated Jews will be one of two reversals, the more grotesque occurring inside the hospital among the Jews themselves. The dying Jews rebel against the living who intruded on their space, and off in a corner, the tubercular girl who is the object of our hero's fantasies promptly rejects his advances. Order is restored only by the fear of the common enemy. Halfway across the world in Palestine, the situation is no different. The old pioneer teacher in Yosef Hayim Brenner's story sorry, spider. Uh, a Talush in khakis begins each day paralyzed with fear. They were sure to come. They could be expected any day now. They would be on that little train that came to fetch the wood. They would be arriving from back there, from the nightmare-ridden waste where the soil lay desolate, the trees hewn down, and the dwellings in ruins, from that dead region where the handful of farmers who were left paid the soldiers billeted in their houses to chop the remaining almond trees into firewood, from the place where the only food was unground millet, to fill the belly and still the pangs of hunger, from the place where damp huts infested with mice and vermin, soggy with filth and permeated with the accumulated stench of months, gave sorry shelter to women and children who were chilled to the marrow and contorted with disease, from the place where out of the surviving hundreds, half a dozen dead were carted away daily for burial. With a war between the Turks and the British raging in the background, what the teacher dreads most is the impending arrival of Jewish refugees. It is they who are about to invade, bringing the apocalyptic landscape of starvation, disease, and death that much closer. His indirect interior monologue is an incantation of terror in which death, detailed and specific, draws near from an indeterminate place. Indeterminate place. In this instance, the educated hero is impelled to take on the establishment, the cynical bureaucrats of the evacuation committee. He even violates one set of rules, those of hygiene, in order to act on a higher biblical standard of morality, but in the end, his energies sapped, and with still newer arrivals expected at any moment, he settles on a purely individual solution, the only way out, succumbing to his own death. And if once there was a young man in whose eyes two bright sparks were burning, like the flames of memorial candles lit early in the evening, and if this young man appeared before the celebrated Yiddish writer David Bergelson in Berlin with a specific plan in mind to assassinate the infamous Ukrainian pogrom leader, the result is a foregone conclusion. The narrative frame undermines the heroism of the hero even before he opens his mouth. He was a stranger, sort of, seemed as if his cheeks were crooked. His left one looked as though it were at war with the world. Once he takes over the narration and monologue, the young man's fixations with his grandfather's clocks, with the Penskes of his childhood, who lived across the boulevard with room number 5 across from his in the pension where he and his would-be victim lived, all reveal a profoundly disturbed mentality. The assassination that seems to rivet his vacillating mind is in fact motivated by petty and personal concerns. To show Penske's beautiful daughter that he is really a man capable of action, in an attempt to procure a gun from a Jewish relief agency, the hero is provoked to his penultimate act of violence, slapping the psychiatrist assigned to help him. Suicide is left for last. The historical reality of which the Toulouse was a distillation was by no means one of passivity. Young Jewish men and women were joining the ranks of revolutionary and Zionist parties in ever growing numbers, and organized resistance was high on their end in Russia, Poland, and Palestine. So much so, in fact, that pogrom victims were now listed by their party affiliation. The published list for the Zitomir pogrom of 1905 also included, probably for the first time, the name of a Christian student, Nikolai Blinov, who died defending the Jews. It was an uncanny instance of life imitating literature. Ansky recalled that shortly before Blinov's death, the two had starred in an amateur production of Yevgeny Shirikov's The Jews, in which Ansky had played Lazar and Blinov had played the Christian student Berezin, who had died protecting Lazar's family in the pogrom. 40 years later, Lamed Shapiro vividly recalled the services held in Blinov's memory. Perhaps for the first time in our history, Jews recited Merciful God in Heaven, El Malai Rahamim, for a goy, not under duress as for the hated Tsar, but with ardent love and bitter sorrow. Also unprecedented were the assassination attempts. Hirsch Likert, a Vilna shoemaker and member of the Jewish Labor Bund, shot at the governor in retaliation for the flogging of a group of workers who had taken part in a May Day rally. A year later, in the spring of 1903, Pinks Deshevsky, a Zionist student from Kiev, avenged the Kishinev pogrom by shooting at a leading anti Semitic agitator named P. Khrushchevin. Both attempts failed. Likert was hanged and revered forever after. Deshevsky was released after serving 2 years at hard labor. He later took part in the search for the murderer in the Bayelis trial and finally perished in a Soviet prison in June 1934. The unsuccessful assassin in Bergelson's story of 1924 turned up in the person of Shalom Schwarzbard, who actually shot and killed Simon Petlura, the infamous leader of the Ukrainian pogroms in May 1926. At the trial in Paris, the atrocities were brought to light and Schwarzbard was acquitted. The same writers who drew the Toulouse's portrait so convincingly were not only aware of these new developments, the organized resistance, the solidarity between Gentiles and Jews, the acts of revenge, but were also aligned with many of these causes. In the aftermath of the Zetomir pogrom, Brenner, an active revolutionary and pioneer to be, cried out for vengeance in a famous monologue in which he spoke as a son to his bereaved mother, and Lamed Shapiro composed a hymn to self-defense. Writers are the conscience of a nation, said the young man at the end of Bergelson's Among Refugees. They are its nerves. They present their nation to the world. People read a writer's works because they want to find out how the nation lived in his time. Was it because revolutionary heroes made for bad literature that the writers presented their nation to the world as a bunch of schizophrenics and abdicated dreamers? Or was it because once they began to explore the life of the educated young Jew, they could not help but see the countervailing forces of fragmentation. The pogrom beast was everywhere and nowhere. When disaster struck the community, a loose coalition of interest groups would fall apart altogether. In the charity hospital, the dying would turn against the living, and in the pioneer settlement, the living would repulse the dying. The elite group of Jewish intellectuals, thus, had no one to attack and no one to lead. And since their own identities were none too secure, these dangling men caught between tradition and a thousand versions of modernity, between loyalty to parents and past and an unfulfilled craving for love and life, could barely hope to save themselves, let alone any larger constituency. The Talush represented the embattled mind of the modern Jew, who had no recourse to either creed or community. At the other extreme were the mindless, brawny Baal ghosts, who never thought twice before picking up an iron bar or the first available woman. The very fear or contemplation of violence was enough to incapacitate the Talush. But what if the violence, when it actually struck, defied the neat categorization of types and shattered the boundary between victim and executioner? What if the pogrom were something so irreducible and elemental that no political platform, however sophisticated, would explain it away? What if its victims were children with no acquired defenses? And what if the violence descended with such speed and brutality that it robbed even adults of their power of speech and severed their ties from family and friends? What if it could happen anytime and anywhere and make its wounds felt long after the danger had passed? These were the questions that no one dared to ask until Lamed Shapiro, born 1878, appeared on the scene and placed the subject of catastrophe at the center of his work. To make the pogrom beast unassimilable, Shapiro adopted an impressionistic style, analytically dispassionate. He stripped his characters of ethnic trappings and intellectual baggage, then thrust them into the vortex of pogroms. And, as in pre modern accounts, he omitted real geographic names and topical references so as not to bracket the violence within a specific time and place.